to you today. To you students, your courage and persistence are admirable. You are our hope for the future, and congratulations on your accomplishment. Thanks also to President Berkey and the rest of the WPI administration for making this space available and for their willingness to listen to students' concerns. Now, as we all know, the reason for this alternative commencement speech is that some students were upset to learn that their college had invited the CEO of ExxonMobil to bestow a message of blessing upon their graduation. As Linnea put it in a letter to WPI President Berkey, quote, "We, as conscientious members of the WPI community and proud members of the class of 2011, will not give the Exxon CEO the honor of imparting his well wishes for our future when he is largely responsible for undermining them." I think Linnea got it exactly right. ExxonMobil is inviting you to take your place in a fossil-fueled 21st century. But I would argue that Exxon's vision of the future is actually just a forward projection from our collective rearview mirror. Despite its high-tech gadgetry, the oil industry is a relic of the days of the Beverly Hillbillies. The fossil-fueled sitcom of a world that we all find ourselves trapped within may on the surface appear to be characterized by smiley-faced happy motoring, but at its core it is monstrous and grotesque. It is a zombie energy economy. Of course, we all use petroleum and natural gas in countless ways and on a daily basis. These are amazing substances. They are energy dense and chemically useful, and they yield enormous economic benefit. America started out with vast reserves of oil and gas, and these helped make our nation the most powerful in the world. But oil and gas are finite resources, so it was clear from the very beginning, as we extracted and burned them, we were in effect stealing from the future. In the early days, the quantities of these fuels available seemed so enormous that depletion posed only a theoretical limit to consumption. We knew we would eventually empty the tanks of Earth's hydrocarbon reserves, but that was a problem for our great-grandkids to worry about. Yet, U.S. oil production has been declining since 1970, even with huge discoveries in Alaska and the Gulf of Mexico. Other countries are also seeing falling rates of both discovery and production. And world crude oil extraction has been flatlined for the last six years, even as oil prices have soared. According to the International Energy Agency in Paris, world crude oil production peaked in 2006 and will taper off from now on. ExxonMobil says this is nothing we should worry about, as there are still vast, untapped hydrocarbon reserves all over the world. That's true. But we have already harvested the low-hanging fruit of our oil and gas endowment. The resources that remain are of lower quality and are located in places that are harder to access than was the case for oil and gas in decades past. Oil and gas companies are increasingly operating in ultra-deep water or in Arctic regions and need to use sophisticated technologies like hydrofracturing, horizontal drilling, and water or nitrogen injection. We have entered the era of extreme hydrocarbons. This means that production costs will continue to escalate year after year. Even if we get rid of oil market speculators, the price of oil will keep ratcheting up anyway. And we know from recent economic history that soaring energy prices cause the economy to wither. When consumers have to spend more on gasoline, they have less to spend on everything else. But if investment costs for oil and gas exploration and extraction are increasing rapidly, the environmental costs of these fuels are ballooning just as quickly. With the industry operating at the limits of its technical know-how, mistakes can and will happen. As we saw in the Gulf of Mexico last summer, Mistakes that occur under a mile or two of ocean water can have devastating consequences for an entire ecosystem and for people who depend on ecosystem services, which is ultimately all of us. The citizens of the Gulf Coast are showing a brave face to the world and understandably want to believe their seafood industry is safe and recovering. But biologists who work in the region tell us that oil from the Deepwater Horizon disaster is still working its way up the food chain. Of course, the biggest environmental cost from burning fossil fuels comes from our chemical alteration of the planetary atmosphere. Carbon dioxide from oil, gas, and coal combustion is changing Earth's climate and causing our oceans to acidify. The likely consequences are truly horrifying. Rising seas, extreme weather, falling agricultural output, and collapsing ocean food chains. Never mind starving polar bears, we're facing the prospect of starving people. But wait, is this even happening? A total of nearly half of all Americans tell pollsters they think either the planet isn't warming at all, or if it is, it's not because of fossil fuels. After all, how can the world really be getting hotter when we're seeing record snowfalls in many places? And even if it is warming, how do we know it's not because of volcanoes or natural climate variation or cow farts, or because the sun is getting hotter? Americans are understandably confused by questions like these, which they hear repeated again and again on radio and television. Now, of course, if you apply the critical thinking skills that you've learned here at WPI to an examination of the relevant data, you'll probably come to the same conclusion as has been reached by the overwhelming majority of scientists who have studied all of these questions in great depth. Indeed, the scientific community is nearly unanimous in assessing that the Earth is warming, and that the only credible explanation for this is rising levels of CO2 from the burning of fossil fuels. That kind of consensus is hard to achieve among scientists, except in situations where a conclusion is overwhelmingly supported by evidence. Now, I'm not out to demonize ExxonMobil, but some things have to be said here today. That company plays a pivotal role in shaping our national conversation about climate change. A 2007 report from the Union of Concerned Scientists described how ExxonMobil adopted the tobacco industry's disinformation tactics and funded some of the same organizations that led campaigns against tobacco regulations in the 1980s, but this time to cloud public understanding of the climate change science and delay action on the issue. According to that report, between 1998 and 2005, ExxonMobil funneled almost $16 million to a network of 43 advocacy organizations that misrepresented peer-reviewed scientific findings about global warming science. Exxon raised doubt about even the most indisputable scientific evidence, attempted to portray its opposition to action as a positive quest for sound science rather than business self-interest, and used its access to the Bush administration to block federal policies and shape government communications about climate change. All of this is well documented, and it worked. Over the course of the past few years, one of our nation's two main political parties has made climate change denial a litmus test for its candidates, which means that climate legislation is effectively unachievable in this country for the foreseeable future. This is a big victory for ExxonMobil. Its paltry $16 million investment will likely translate to many times that amount in unregulated profits. But it's a disaster for democracy, for the Earth, and for your generation. But here's the thing. Everyone knows that America and the world will have to transition off of fossil fuels during this century anyway. Mr. Tillerson knows it as well as anyone. Some people evidently want to delay that transition as long as possible, but it cannot be put off indefinitely. My colleagues at Post Carbon Institute and I believe that delaying this transition is extremely dangerous for a number of reasons. Obviously, it prolongs the environmental impacts from fossil fuel production and combustion. But also, the process of building a renewable energy economy will take decades and require a tremendous amount of investment. If we don't start soon enough, society will get caught in a trap of skyrocketing fuel prices and a collapsing economy, and won't be in a position to fund needed work on alternative energy development. In my darker moments, I fear that we have already waited too long and that it is already too late. I hope I'm not right about that. And when I talk to young people like you, I tend to feel that we can make this great transition, and that actions that have seemed politically impossible for the past 40 years will become inevitable as circumstances change and as new hearts and minds come to the table. Even in the best case, though, the fact that we have waited so long to address our addiction to oil will still present us with tremendous challenges. But this is not a problem for ExxonMobil, at least not anytime soon. When the price of oil goes up, we feel the pain while Exxon reaps the profits. Even though Exxon's actual oil production is falling due to the depletion of its oil fields, corporate revenues are flush. Exxon made almost $11 billion in profits in just the last 3 months. This translates to jobs in the oil industry, but how about the renewable energy industry, which everyone agrees is the key to our future? For the past 40 years, every U.S. president, without exception, has said we must reduce our country's dependence on petroleum. Addiction to oil has become our nation's single greatest point of geopolitical, economic, and environmental vulnerability. Yet here we are in 2011, still driving a fleet of 200 million gas-guzzling cars, trucks, and SUVs. The inability of our elected officials to tackle such an obvious problem is not simply the result of ineptitude. In addition to funding climate denial, fossil fuel companies like Exxon have contributed to politicians' election campaigns in order to gain perks for their industry and to put off higher efficiency standards and environmental protections. Denying looming fuel supply problems, discouraging a transition to renewable energy, distorting climate science, these are all understandable tactics from the standpoint of corporate self-interest. Exxon is just doing what corporations do. But once again, it is society as a whole that suffers, and the consequences will fall especially on your generation. Mr. Tillerson could have informed you about his company's global climate and energy project at Stanford University. Exxon is now funding research into lowering the cost and increasing the efficiency of solar photovoltaic devices, increasing the efficiency of fuel cells, increasing the energy capacity of lithium-ion batteries for electric cars, designing higher efficiency engines that produce lower emissions, making biodiesel fuel from bacteria, and improving carbon capture and storage. This is all admirable if it is genuine and not just window dressing. Here's a reality check on that. Exxon is investing about $10 million a year in the global climate and energy project, all of the things that I just told you about. An amount that almost exactly equals Mr. Tillerson's personal compensation in 2010. $10 million also equals about 3 hours worth of Exxon profits from last year. You tell me if you think that is a sensibly proportionate response to the problems of climate change and oil depletion from the world's largest energy company. No. Even if Exxon's investments in a sustainable energy future were of an appropriate scale, they come very late in the game. We are still in a bind. That's because there is no magic bullet energy source out there that will enable world energy supplies to continue to grow as fossil fuels dwindle. Renewable energy is viable and necessary, and we should be doing far more to develop it. But solar, wind, geothermal, tidal, and wave power are currently supplying only a trivial fraction of our total energy.